Almost, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm happy to be with you all on this Sunday. I want to begin talking about a paper that a colleague and I published a couple of years ago. The topic is on the human dimensions of insect pollinator conservation. And I think that this research that we did, the synthesis paper, can be summed up with a meme. This meme is, I remember when I used to see a bee and go, yikes, a bee. And now I'm all, oh, wow, a bee. Hi, you okay there? Need anything? Can I get you a drink? A cushion? Want to borrow the car? People now like bees. This has changed in my lifetime. As a society and a culture, we love bees now. And we know that this is driven by the fact that we can't live without them. Like our food or a breakfast without bees. In this image, about 1 in 3 bites of food is from some item that was pollinated by a bee. Maybe if you're one of the 86% of Americans addicted to coffee, it's bee dependent, and that would greatly affect the price of coffee without bees. There are a number of other images as well that show that our food choices would be decimated without our insect pollinators. And we see some of the implications of losses of insect pollinators already. This is an image of pollinating by hand of oranges in China. And if you think this affects price of produce, you're absolutely right. We also have seen increases in prices of pollinator-dependent crops such as almonds, which are dependent upon bombus impatiens, so bumblebees, as well as the hornface bee. And it's not just fruits, vegetables, and nuts. This is alfalfa crops, and this is the alfalfa leafcutter bee. We've seen destabilization in prices as well. And alfalfa is important because it's fed to cattle, so that's beef, as well as dairy cows. And so that's also ice cream. Oh boy. So we know that it's not simply a matter of throwing more managed honeybees at these crops. Native bees pollinate all crops. A lot of it is invisible. We don't really know the impact of our native bees on crops. A single species of a native bee, like a bumblebee or an orchard bee or a mason bee, can be more effective than 60 or 80 honeybees. So the threat of losing these native bees looms on our economies. Because of price increases with foods, that can also destabilize our economies. This is of interest to governments and a major concern of governments. Certain concerns around destabilized food prices has led to groups like the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. In their first report in 2016, they examined pollinators and created a document for lawmakers. In it, they found that approximately $235 to $577 billion is the annual value of global crops directly affected by insect pollinators. And alarmingly, about 40% of invertebrate pollinator species, particularly bees and butterflies, face extinction. Scientists have been gathering and synthesizing this research to make policy recommendations. And it's in the spirit of the precautionary principle that we have enough information to act, but what are lawmakers doing? What is happening within the policy space? And that's what I want to take a tour with you today and move through those spaces. I want to first start, before I begin this tour, talking about how I got interested in this subject. In the late 1990s, as a college student, as Laura mentioned at Purdue, I took a course on beekeeping from Tom Turpin. A honeybee geneticist had a job opening for a full-time beekeeper. I needed the money. I was very interested in bees, so I applied. On my first day of the job, I was called into a rail yard that had been completely shut down by a swarm of honeybees. There were 12 grown men standing about 150 feet away, terrified, pointing up to a grain elevator. It was the yikes, a bee days. I climbed on top of a hopper car, removed the swarm, and 2 years later, I was extracting semen from drones, artificially inseminating queens, teaching courses on beekeeping for cooperative extension. And I ended up managing 115 hives, including 15 hives of Africanized bees for a PhD student who was studying aggressive behavior in bees and their genes. It was the second spring of the job of 2001, where I went to open the hives and I found that about 75% of the hives were dead or severely dwindled. It was the first time that we had seen colony collapse disorder. And it baffled my boss, who's a brilliant bee geneticist, who's been on the Discovery Channel talking about his research. He was utterly baffled by this. I eventually went on to graduate school to study social sciences and policy, but I always followed the bee news. It was in 2006 that colony collapse disorder was named as an ailment of bees, and the public was just becoming appropriately alarmed. By 2013, Time magazine had the cover story about a world without bees. And we know now that it's not just the European honeybee that has experienced declines. That's what we saw first. We're also seeing those declines in the abundances of wild bees and native bees. And so this is pretty frightening if you know your agricultural geography. In terms of things that we value and we eat, and I'm thinking about my toddler's needs of off-season fruits. This is alarming that we have declines in Central Valley. And then if you appreciate hops, this is alarming as well, the loss of these native bees. We know that there are many stressors on bees, and it's kind of a death by 1,000 cuts, a lot of combinations of these stressors. The first and most important is habitat, that we have become very effective at using our lands. We can farm where we used to have fence rows. You think about the farms from the 19 teens and 20s, where most of Americans lived on farms. There was a back 40 acres. There was a diversity of crops that led to a diversity of vegetation and the need for pasture land. Now that's changed with agriculture. So we use land more efficiently and effectively, but that also leads to fewer floral resources for bees. Combine that with better living through chemistry. We have a new class of nicotine-based pesticides, for example, that was just introduced in 1993, which now is about a third of all crops in the world are treated with these nicotine-based pesticides, the neonicotinoids. There are also fungicides, pyrethroids, and then combine all that with parasites and pathogens of managed bees as well as wild bees. These stressors have caused severe declines in bumblebees, and these matter in terms of thinking about in terms of stressors, because this is where policy implications are. Our environmental policies, every single one of them regulates human behavior. So this is where we begin to look at what human behaviors can be adjusted to help bees. Policy is catching up with the science, but perhaps where we don't want it to. This is the listing of the first species in the lower 48 states, the rusty patch bumblebee, listed in 2017. Trends are clear that this listing signals other trends in bumblebee declines. And listing a species as endangered is really a big deal, because it takes a lot of research, a lot of meetings, a lot of politics, a lot of biology. Funding priorities have to be shifted around. And right now there are a backlog of species that need full investigation. And so for the rusty patch to be listed is pretty severe. We know more data are needed, but the risks are really quite terrifying. Same trends in other bumblebees. This is the Western bumblebee. This study just came out a couple of years ago that numbers have dwindled by 93% in the past 2 decades. Butterflies, the same story. Here's a study of 450 species of butterfly in the Western United States, and total number of butterflies across all species shrunk by about 1.6% for the past 4 decades. That's 64% of declines. A lot of this is warmer weather that stresses plants that the butterflies rely on for food and habitat. As we know, much of the American West is getting drier. The story is the same with different data sets all over the world. These are data sets from Brazil and others that we're looking at international networks of data. Australia. Past 2 years, scientists are beginning to see patterns of decline in relation to changing climate and weather patterns. This is a study on bumblebee species richness, so species diversity, and climate change factors such as temperature and precipitation are having a much larger effect than other landscape variables. So anything in orange or darker orange is bad. This is happening for all species of insects, but the implications for pollinators are perhaps easiest for us to imagine. So there's this study, and then these are the same on climate numbers. What are the implications and what are we to do as human societies in order to save the bees? Meta-study after meta-study shows that the consistent driver of pollinator health is flowers. It's the presence and the diversity of flowers, the timing of that diversity and presence of flowers. That is the source of insect pollinator health. Despite this consensus, we know that a consensus of science does not automatically lead to good policy. In fact, natural resource policy and environmental management is a social practice, often lacking scientific grounds. It's driven by external forces and divergent perspectives of problems and solutions. So what my lab has been trying to do is take a look at some of these external forces and divergent perspectives of problems and solutions. Through one study on insect pollinator policies on US state legislatures. I'll talk about that. So I first started to look at pollinator policy. Clearly, we know there's a problem. In June of 2014, President Obama coordinated the Pollinator Health Task Force to address what was called the insect pollinator health crisis. A couple names that are familiar, Tom Vilsack and Gina McCarthy with chairs. They coordinated 15 different federal agencies that had something to do with federal lands to draft an action plan. What I wanted to know is, what is being done about this in policy? So we have something at the executive level and in the White House being done. What's happening at the legislative level? Are there policies that are being created that befit and address a crisis? So I first looked at US federal government from 2000 to 2017 and saw 31 bills proposed that had something to do with insect pollinators, where only 4 were passed. There were no standout laws. One declared a National Pollinator Week, another focused on beekeeping, but none of these really were befitting of a crisis. I didn't see sweeping international treaties. We still haven't seen those. And so it seems, because laws are something we all agree on based on our value, it seems like there is an international and national policy. It suffers from a lack of agreement on substance rather than public desire. So in the absence of comprehensive national legislation, the study that we did looked at US state legislatures. And we wanted to see what states were doing, where are the innovations. That is the case with a lot of environmental policy. States come up with an idea, they pilot it, they test it, and if the good ideas kind of raise and scale up in federal scale. States are responsible for regulating livestock and wild animals. Honeybees, some species of bumblebees, alfalfa leafcutter bees, orchard bees are managed as livestock. And so they are in many ways like cattle. They're registered, monitored for disease. The other bees, the native bees, are considered wildlife. They're wild critters. They are the responsibility of US states. They're to be held in trust for the use of the citizens, like other wildlife. Of course, both of these agencies at the state level work with federal agencies, the US Department of Ag and the US Fish and Wildlife Service, but bees are largely the responsibility of the states. Because insects like native bees and butterflies are wildlife, we wanted to look at what states were doing. So we had general research questions that were searching for a consensus around policy. due to the lack of consensus at the federal level and international level. So what state policies are being passed relevant to insect pollinators is what we were asking, as well as of those that were passed, what are the policy areas of agreement? We looked at all 50 US state legislatures for laws passed related to insect pollinators between 2000 and 2017. US states were also selected because legislators most closely resemble the American people. America has 7,383 legislators. They know their constituents well. They know the regional agricultural crops. They know how much people value their home state's biodiversity. And then also, as I mentioned, these policies can be scaled up. This time frame of 2000-2017 captures the pre-colony collapse disorder. It also captures some of the widely publicized events around bee kills, like the Wilsonville, Oregon bee kill in 2013, and then the White House Pollinator Health Task Force. We looked at only bills that were passed into law. So only those that were signed into law by governors, because they represent a point of majority agreement among legislators that cross those traditional divides of right-left, rural-urban, secular-religious, rich-poor, etc. What we found were 109 policies or laws that increased in frequency following 2013. And that could be due to some of the widely publicized bee kills. We counted all of these laws passed, that's in the top table, noted that 14 states had none passed during this time, 5 states had more than 7 laws passed. It's important to note that the number of policies passed does not reflect the strength of the policy. So Connecticut and Vermont, for example, only passed 1 or 2, but they were quite comprehensive in what they covered. The look at what was occurring in the legislative branches means that we didn't cover what was happening in the executive or governor's offices, so it doesn't cover those laws. These actions initiated by state legislatures and legislators, however, does reflect level of agreement. So what we did is we cataloged these in table 1, put all of the policies together so they could be reviewed by other lawmakers, legislative staff, other NGOs, other people who are interested in learning what language works within their state or what may work in their state. We cataloged and sorted them by themes by reading about 1,100 pages of law. And we do see this as a resource of what is the legal language that works for insect pollinators. Here's how we found and gathered these laws. This is our search protocol. Here is what a graduate student and I read, 1,100 pages of these, and sorted. We found that states wrote and passed law to address insect pollinator declines around 5 thematic areas. And these are apiculture, so honeybee management, registering hives, disposal of equipment, disease concerns, etc. Pesticides, including training as well as licensing, some moratoriums on neonicotinoid use on state lands, research both in the needs for funding and then specific to colony collapse disorder, habitat, conservation of, enhancement, and then also awareness. There are lots of pollinator awareness week policies or some that address knowledge needs. Across the 109, we also saw trends. These trends include states innovating laws for pollinators as wildlife and livestock. Most laws were updating antiquated laws or were updating registration and monitoring of managed hives for disease. We also saw something that's quite exciting in terms of there's evidence of insects no longer being indiscriminately lumped together as pests, bugs, and in fact, legislators are revising these old policies to acknowledge that indeed some insects are actually beneficial to humankind. These policies represent legal areas of majority consensus and bipartisan agreement. And we think that these evidence viable national or international policy, and they can inform the design of those policies and laws. We wanted to look at these policies in a global context as well. And so we compared what the US states were doing in our analysis of those state laws with what is being called for by the international and intergovernmental bodies of scientists and biologists. And so authors from the international community of scientists developed this 10 policy targets for pollinators. This is Lynn Dix's work, and she and her group came up with these. So raising pesticide regulatory standards, integrated pest management, monitoring, thinking about new ways of agriculture and diversified farming systems, etc. We took our 109 policies passed at US state levels and compared them with these, and essentially did a rereading of those laws and categorized them by these 10 categories. What we saw and found is that there are 5 areas that states did not address at all. So these are what international scientists say should be addressed, 5 are unaddressed. And so I think what is most alarming, you can see that's in the zeros, or we would count the 1 and the 2 here, 2 laws address those. Most alarming is the lack of policy action related to monitoring. So monitoring native bees and insect pollinator populations is critical to learn if the conservation actions that we're doing is actually making a difference, or if there are new stressors on bee populations that enter the environment. Like water quality monitoring, we need some form of bee quality monitoring. Based on these comparisons, we do conclude that despite a rise in policy action at state levels, these policies are really early and an anemic step for addressing a crisis. There were a few standout states, and most promising innovations were within Connecticut, Vermont, Minnesota, and California. They established funding mechanisms and appropriations for habitat enhancement and for research. And then these states also established task forces that coordinated various experts to address the problem in combination with their state's agriculture and their geography, social settings, often including university researchers from land grants and the experts within their state and industry. There are still bills being passed regularly related to insect pollinators each year. So there's more to come from that, and we'll continue to pay attention to that. I want to turn away from this anemic activity of the legislative branch and look at the executive branches. So this would be at the federal level, the White House, and state levels, the governor's offices, which manages and also is in charge of departments of agriculture and departments of wildlife. Humans are not the only ones affected by this crisis. We know that over 2/3 of all plants used for forage by wildlife require bee pollination. That's why a number of wildlife and natural resource agencies and nonprofit organizations are developing pollinator conservation programming for wildlife, focused on wildlife. So perhaps we should amend the 1 out of 3 bites to say 2 out of 3 bites of food wildlife eats is pollinated by a bee. Also, state and federal agencies are working together to address this problem in their states for habitat, both of bees, but also of wildlife. An example of state agencies' interagency coordination is in this press release about monarch butterflies. 4 state agencies in Illinois are working together to try to figure out what they can do for monarch habitat within Illinois. Another coordinating effort among state and federal agencies is around the wildlife management, and this is embodied in a document called the State Wildlife Action Plans. So these are a decadal strategic document written by each state's state wildlife management agency. It is tied to federal funding for non-game species, So most states' wildlife agencies have a way of getting money for conservation of game species through tags and licenses. But non-game species, it's difficult to get conservation funding for it. So this is tied to federal funding, provided that states come up with these 10-year documents. So what we're doing now is we are looking at the 2015 to 2025 state wildlife action plans. There are 55 of them, so all states and then 5 territories. And we're analyzing these for how states are addressing insect pollinators and bees. I have a student looking at bees. I have another student working on monarch butterflies and how they appear in these documents. And then I have another undergraduate student who's working on the rusty patch bumblebee and how it shows up within these 2015 documents as well as the 2005 documents. So this is in process, but of note for the 2015 documents, there are 8 states that make no mention of bees or insect pollinators in their wildlife action plans. And these are pretty large documents. There are about 32,000 pages of these documents across all 55 state wildlife action plans. And so to not have bees or insect pollinators on the radar in 2014 or 2013, whenever the state wildlife agency was writing it, is a bit alarming. I want to transition to talking about bees in cities and focus on some municipal policy innovations. Urban areas, we're seeing a surprising finding that cities have diverse and abundant populations of bees. We're seeing this in the US, here's San Fran, studies in Berkeley, New York and Phoenix, Canadian cities, Australian cities, European cities. Bees are in cities. They're able to live. Here are a number of UK cities. And in many cases, these bees are even able to thrive in the urban environments. And this is counterintuitive. And perhaps what's most shocking is that in a few cases, more diverse and abundant populations of native bees live in cities than in the nearby rural landscapes. These are the studies that show that. It flips everything we thought we knew about cities as biological deserts and just only destroyers of habitat. And it causes us to pause and rethink some assumptions. Indeed, it raises concerns about trends within rural areas in terms of land use and homogenization among suburban areas. But this also calls for seeing our urban and suburban lands anew, particularly in an urban world or an urbanizing world where by 2050, the UN estimates 67% of Earth's people will live in cities. What is it about our urban land uses that enable bees? Cities are human-dominated landscapes. Tansley, the ecologist, called cities anthropogenic ecosystems. So I see this as a social and cultural question. It's a question about how we as people do cities. There's something about diverse people and diverse people's preferences for diverse plants and for urban landscapes that works for bees. This has implications for urban planning, urban design, and policy across a variety of scales. In light of these findings, there are policy implications for our state wildlife agencies and our federal wildlife agencies. How should they engage in urban conservation programming? In the 1980s and 1990s, many natural resource management agencies developed outreach programs on urban wildlife conservation, spurred in part due to declining hunting and fishing license sales, but also a desire to gain new visitors. And it's always good to remind urban voters what their agency does for them, certainly when it comes time to vote on state level funding. These agencies in those days took rural activities and largely game species activities to the urban areas. And so taking city kids fishing, for example, the programming looked like ambassadorial work rather than conservation work that could achieve meaningful conservation objectives. Because native bee habitats are relatively small, certainly compared to larger mammals like ocelots in Texas or Florida panthers. Many bees, native bees, can live their entire lives in a 10 by 10 meter yard, provided there's habitat and forage and nesting space. In fact, they prefer not to leave that area. Multiple generations can live there. So there are achievable conservation objectives that can be attained in cities. And this is a scale at which conservation can be done by businesses, homeowners, and municipalities that in aggregate can improve insect pollinator populations. So in response to this, that urban habitat is valuable to pollinator health, there are city-funded bee projects and bee gardens. So we are taking a look at taxpayer-funded municipal policy efforts. Here's one in Germany, spending 1.5 million euros to plant and manage nearly 100 bee gardens across German cities. Another in San Antonio, there's the North American Friendship Park, which is funding Pollinator Park. Funding is from Mexico, Canada, and the US, and some private donors, but also city funds in San Antonio. In Malta, 300,000 euros to develop a pollinator garden that they are combining revitalization, pollinator education with habitat. And then in Stirling, Scotland, there's an Alive with Nature plan to plant over 160,000 trees by 2025. This uses city funds, and a part of this emphasis is on insect pollinators. New York City last year developed something called Pollinator Places that they are funding native plant patches within city properties. And they have 8 established so far. Amsterdam is funding these pollinator hotels throughout the city. Bee stops, bee hotels, coupled with flowers. Some of these odd urban spaces, such as bus stop rooftops, are being converted, planted with green roofs. And if you've ever been under a bus stop, at a bus stop in the summer, I can imagine this would help quite a bit. Not only providing habitat, but a lot of shade and absorbing that heat energy. Utrecht has 316 of these. Leicester in the UK has 30. Some in Wales and Dublin. San Francisco has 14. Buffalo, Philadelphia. And Hamburg, Germany, just last year pledged 3 million euros to put green roofs on 4,200 of their bus stops. This initiative will last from 2021 to 2024. So this is publicly funded insect pollinator habitat. It's extended to bus stops, but also, strangely enough, to buses. In Singapore, as a way to reduce emissions and improve air quality. Also, these are being piloted in Spain. They're putting green roofs on buses. Now, if you're a bee, you have to think about this. This is pretty helpful. You're at your bus stop, you're eating, and along comes a bus. You can eat some more, then you can stay at your bus stop. It's like having the ice cream truck come to your neighborhood regularly. I don't know, every 10 minutes or so, depending on where you live. Bees are notoriously lazy, despite what most people think. They're notoriously lazy, and so this takes laziness to the next level. In Utrecht, in the Netherlands, we mentioned they started, credited with starting these bus stop green roof projects. They have an incentive in their no roofs unused policy up to 20,000 euros for homeowners and businesses to redesign their roofs to act as natural greenscapes. And in fact, this was oversubscribed to the program in 2020, became so popular that the city has begun to make these green roofs an obligation for certain buildings. Amsterdam is a similar program, not with the mandates, but 4.8 million euros of funding to install 10,000 square meters of green roofs, but they're piloting a green, it's called a blue-green roof, which focuses on stormwater attenuation that'll hold the water and slow down storm events in terms of the water load. These ordinances for green roofs actually coming to the US as well. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, there's an ordinance that went into effect this past June that new construction of buildings of 25,000 square feet or more must include a green roof or a biosolar roof, which combines vegetation and solar panels on 80% of the available roof area. This is quite interesting. I think you guys would be interested in this as well. And I put this paper here, which does a great job of outlining how this group called Mothers Out Front really organized over a period of I think 5 or 6 years in order to get this policy requirement passed in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Some of the techniques they use that are laid out in this article may work for you. But of course, in Chicago, you have a green permit program that has a series of carrots and incentives for green roofs, and have had that for quite a while, relative in comparison to other states and nations. And what this green permit program does is that if you have a green roof, you can get up to $5,000 in installation costs, small scale commercial and residential properties. I'm not sure the status of that program. My information on that is a little old, but they're originally kicks it off with some sort of incentive. You also have an expedited permit process that can move building permits from 90 days to less than 30 days if a green roof is incorporated. And then for developers, there's a floor area ratio bonus for green roofs. Essentially, developers can make more money by being able to develop more units per square foot on the same plot. So they can build more square footage on that plot. The city gets more square footage of green roofs without a large expense. There is also a mandate. So there's a stick as well, where the developer who receives city assistance is required to have a green roof. There are 509 vegetated green roofs within the city. This is according to the city, and this is 5.5 million square feet of green roof coverage. This is equivalent to 126 acres of green roof space. This is really quite impressive. Does it work? Do they work for bees? Indeed, a colleague of mine did a study, Rebecca Tonieto's work out of Northwestern. Native bees are present on green roofs, although at a lower abundance and diversity than some of the reference habitats. The comparative habitats were prairies, other areas you'd imagine. These green roofs are potentially valuable sites for bee conservation in urban areas if planted with diverse native forbs and designed for nesting. This leads us to begin to rethink urban lands and perhaps think of them as productive lands, biologically, ecologically. I work with a lot of farmers throughout the US, and there's a thread that they talk about. It's this making land productive, making it useful. This utilitarianism can be extended to a more biocentric view, thinking about making urban lands more beneficial to ecosystems and to bees. I like this quote from Gregory Bateson, systems thinker: "The major problems of the world are the result of a difference between how nature works and the way people think." Several municipalities are beginning rethinking this, and I think this is really quite exciting. Residential spaces, residential yards account for 25 to 60% of total green space in many US cities. These spaces are often overlooked. We need to begin thinking of homeowners as land managers or habitat managers, certainly because bees can live their entire lives in yards, urban yards. It's time to begin rethinking your yard in terms of bee habitat. There are weedy species in grass mixes that feed bees. That creeping Charlie battle that you may have going on, maybe suspend the war or have a truce in the early season to allow bees to have forage at that time, and then reconvene when everything else is in bloom. Same thing with the dandelions. The dandelions are critical for bumblebees at the early season. Mid-season, there are other things to eat, but in the beginning of the year, critical for setting up that colony. Some of the best studies on the role of lawns and the value of the forage is from Susanna Lehrman. In a 2014 study, she had 3 groups of homeowners. She asked them to mow at 3 different regimes. One, the control group mowed once every week, and then they'd come out and they'd sample bees. Another group mowed once every 2 weeks, and they came out and sampled bees. And they found for those who mowed once every 2 weeks, there was a 60% increase in the number of bee species. For those that mowed once every 3 weeks, there was a 300% increase in the number of bee species. So if you don't like mowing your yard, maybe print off this article, the Lehrman and Millam 2016, and share that with your neighbors or your neighborhood or your homeowners association. This policy that I think is perhaps most innovative in terms of residential yards is Minnesota's Lawns to Legumes program. Minnesota's paying homeowners up to $500 to convert their lawns to prairies or to forage. So filling it with forbs instead of just grasses. This is emerged from the governor-initiated statewide insect pollinator task force, the partnership of university, industry, and government. It was really from a governor's leadership of the governor. And the focus was on rusty patch bumblebee habitat as well. The policy was extremely popular. The first year, there were 7,500 applications for 1,000 awards, and that's in 84 of Minnesota's 87 counties were represented. So here's a before and here's an after. Clearly, it's desired by the residents. And it's an example of where the policy is catching up and aligning to the science. Unfortunately, we have many outdated and outmoded examples of city ordinances and weed ordinances and nuisance property laws. This is in St. Louis, a Maplewood woman may be sent to jail over a dispute about the definition of a weed. Alex Hazel received at least 5 citations because of her flowers. She was growing milkweed because of its natural habitat for the Monarch, as well as our mayor, who joined the Milkweeds for Monarchs pledge and told us all to grow milkweed. But what she violated was the owner or leasee renter shall not allow or maintain any growth of grass or weeds to a height of 12 inches or more. We can't throw our residents in jail for doing the right thing for conservation. These laws need to be updated. Perhaps even more disturbing is the St. Peter's couple battle over a turf requirement. So Janice Duffner was allergic to turf grass, and she found that when she took it out, she could sleep through the night, didn't have to use an inhaler. So they removed all the turf grass. Then they got cited in 2014 that they had violated a 2008 city ordinance requiring all homeowners to have at least 50% of their lot covered in, quote, turf grass. The Duffners face extreme fines from $7,500 to $188,000 and 20 or more years in jail. It ended up going to federal courts and to the Supreme Court, and the court ruled with the city. Supreme Court ruled that the aesthetic considerations constitute a legitimate government purpose. So these need to be amended, and many towns and cities have amended these. For example, my hometown of Columbia, Missouri, there's the traditional landscape maintenance laws, and then there is a list of 2 bulleted exceptions. And one of those exceptions is native plants. Other things you can do if you are under these areas, you can put a sign up, which I'm sure many of you have, or mow an edge on it, showing a mowed edge shows a cue to care. Chicago has a lawn registry that was just enacted last year that creates a registry of pollinator-friendly yards, which lists them as exempt from being fined from the city or violating the nuisance code. Maryland has a similar policy that was just passed last year as well, stating that homeowners associations cannot prevent the planting of native plants designed to attract and support pollinators. What I would recommend is meeting first, learning the legal code, and this is the link for this municode.com is excellent, and this is for Cook County, Illinois. Meeting with your code enforcement officer after you talk and read through the legal code can be effective. because each enforcement officer has a different way of interpreting the code locally. I have a neighbor nearby that has native plants and a vegetable garden, and she had a next door neighbor who kept mowing her yard. And so she put up a deer fence. Neighbor complained to the city, and when the code enforcement officer came out, the code enforcement officer just told her to mow a strip around it, and then pointed to the native plants exception policy within the municipal code to her neighbor. I talked with that code enforcement officer later, and she said that she's an advocate for native plants, but it's best to talk with code enforcement officers and understand how they're interpreting those policies. There are temporary suspensions of these weed ordinances, like this No Mow May program developed by Xerxes Society that relaxes the city codes in May, so early spring. This is for Wisconsin. That allows the plants available for bees to avoid that bottleneck. There's a food bottleneck for bees that I mentioned. It is in March and September, and this study showed that September is the strongest predictor of bumblebee colony density for the following year, based on the availability of forage in September. And so in March, April, May, and September, those months are extremely important for determining the health of that colony. The last example I'll talk about is landscape scale. This is the Oslo Bee Highway in Norway. They wanted to figure out how a bee could move through the city to some of the forage areas on either side. And what they did through stakeholder-led project was they began mapping and developing a highway for the bees to move through. And so coupling this with rooftop gardens and other city properties that are converted to insect pollinator habitat. Similar with city funds in Tallinn, Estonia, that 13-kilometer long pedestrian and pollinator corridor, and it's coupling pollinators and urban revitalization and health. So in summary, I've taken you through a policy tour of insect pollinators policy at national, state, or subnational, and municipal levels, and across executive, legislative, and judicial branches. In some, there are activities and innovations that are encouraging, I'll say with the exception of the courts. And there are still many laws that are outmoded or outdated or even pathological for our biological reality. They don't align with how nature works. Policy and laws are mutually agreed upon. They are reflections of our values. They are very much about human behavior. And so in light of the conservation status of bees and global declines and the findings around the value of urban and suburban habitat, these are very empirical biological facts that have explicit ties to our food security, our economic security, and national security. So how tightly should we cling to some of our social constructions about aesthetic considerations? It's important to be reminded that the American lawn is a social construct. We made it up. We all agreed to it. Industries formed around it and perpetuated these constructions. It's something to think about in terms that the beauty of any social construction is that it can be reconstructed for a different way, for seeing the value of bees, food, and pollinators. The research is clear. Loss of flowers equals a loss of bees. Loss of bees equals a loss of quality of life and food security. Small city and suburban yards can have an impact, and small policy changes can lead to larger changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Damon. That was wonderful.
Okay, shall we get going with some questions?
Yeah.
I have a few myself, but I'm going to be quiet and let other people see what they have to ask. The first question goes back to Purdue University. Anthony would like to know if you have anything to say about ankle biter bees at Purdue and Queens, ankle biter bees in Queens.
I do not know what he's talking about.
Okay, all right.
Is that yeah, I'm not sure if it's a Purdue reference, is that a Pan-Hellenic reference or yeah, I'm not sure what he's talking about. Yeah.
All right. He would also, more serious question. He says he's curious if you've ever looked at how major corporations view these pollinator policies being implemented by both federal and state governments, and whether they accept or reject the premises in which these policies are being formulated. And I would add on to that, is that related to the fact that there are zero policies for diversified farming systems?
Yeah, I have not looked at corporate responses to these policies or other policies. Yeah, so I'm not really sure the answer to that question. Of course, anything that that threatens the interests of any business is at stake for any type of pushback. And so if that may be at play here, I'm sure it's at play somewhere, but I have not really found evidence of that or really looked into that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think like neonics, though, there's been such pushback on neonics, and that is a very fraught and complicated subject.
Absolutely. Yeah, in the paper that we wrote a couple of years ago, we were really asking for where is the response that something else is being developed, or where's the industry response or the promise to the public saying, hey, look, we're working on something better. We're working on something else. So that's something we call for. Agriculture is part of the solution. We've got to figure this out, both for farming and for farmers, as well as for bees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one remarkable thing in Illinois. We don't have any policies like that. We have a lot of voluntary things farmers can do. And then the Illinois Monarch project specifically worked with agricultural groups to develop their plan.
I think that's the route that has to be done in order to move forward with something that's effective and innovative.
Yeah, right. I mean, those non-fertile corners, you don't have to plant them in short corn. You can bad soy. Okay, so Brandy says cities may have more diverse bee populations, but with the trend of backyard honeybee keeping rising so dramatically, 185% in my county in the last 10 years. I don't know what county that is, but what does this mean for the endangered bumblebees in her county?
Yeah, you have a finite amount of food and forage and flowers in any place. And so if you have one population of native bees and you introduce a hive with 60,000 super efficient general foragers, you're competing for those same forage resources. So backyard beekeeping is problematic for native bees. It's not a solution to saving the bees by adding more honeybees. The solution truly is planting flowers.
Yeah, plant more flowers.
And it's tough because people want to do something, right? And people love bees, and so people want to ensure they have good pollination of their gardens. But truly, you have that finite resource, and you're just inviting these super efficient European honeybees to compete for those same resources.
Right.
Have you? Oh,
go ahead.
Sorry, Adrian. So, have you ever come across any laws or ordinances that require people to provide forage material for their honeybees? Or
I have not. There are efforts to monitor and document the growth of backyard beekeeping and forced registration, which registration for beehives in most states, you have to have a certain threshold of the number. You're establishing an apiary for business. But there are efforts to document this backyard movement.
I think it's a fad myself, because it's not, you have to tend the bees, you have to pay attention to the bee. I mean, you know better than I, but
A lot of work. It's
Yeah.
a lot of work. It really
Yeah.
is.
I mean, compared to plant flowers, the native bees know what to do, just plant flowers. I mean, yeah. Okay, so then we had someone saying he would think that Chris said he thought that mobile foraging ranges, i.e. buses, would disrupt bee home resource navigation. And I imagined in response that some small solitary bees could maybe live on the bus.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It'd be really neat to see what kind of nesting resources are on the buses. I don't know. That'd be pretty tough. I don't know if they would live on there. Because where are they parked? What? Who knows? I don't know. It's so new in Singapore. Not really sure what the effects on the bees are or would be.
Right. But I imagine, if you're talking bumblebees who can go 2 miles or so,
Sure.
they that could just be a patch where they stop. And Brandy was asking again about exceeding honeybee density capacities, but I think we talked about that. People, a joke, green roofs solve the plant-eating deer problem. Thanks for the tip on creeping Charlie.
I see the clarification on the Purdue ankle biters.
Ah.
Yeah, these, I know what you're talking about now. These are, that was my former boss, Greg Hunt, developed breeding of bees that have high levels of grooming behavior. And so what they do is, they groom more often than other bees. And so they're bred for that and selected for that. And so what effectively they end up doing is getting the varroa mites off of their bodies, whereas other bees would leave them on and it would affect their health. So yeah, thanks for that in the chat, Anthony. Yeah.
Beverly has a comment. Funding to legislators from corporations will sway policy. Pollinators don't vote or contribute. But I think that goes to your point about humans. Okay, here's a question. Do bees migrate such that improving bee habitat in urban areas would increase bees in agricultural areas?
Bees will move to forage. And so where they establish their nests, their offspring may establish a nest a few miles in a different direction. So they will move in that regard. Not necessarily migrate in the way that monarch populations do large migrations, but there is an indicator of a spillover effect that Dave Goulson writes about, where you have a robust population of bees in an urban area and they will move to rural and agricultural areas. And so there is some promise around increasing the health of those populations, and cities can help surrounding rural and ag areas.
All right. Okay, more questions in relation to the Purdue bees. Where would the varroa mites go once they were displaced by the grooming honeybees? Drop onto flowers to get picked up by other bees?
Yeah, I'm not sure 100% what happens with that, whether they are injured in some way or if they're just dropped. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay. All right. In the April-May 2019 issue of the National Wildlife Magazine, there was an article entitled "Bloom or Bust" by Laura Tangley. Do you know anything about this grant? But I'm not sure what grant this person.
Yeah, that's the National Wildlife Foundation grants. Yep, they come out, I think every year. And I think I applied for one maybe in 2015 or 2016. So that's all I know about those grants, but yes.
Okay. Oh, we just got a lot. 5-year, $6.5 million grant from the U.S. Department of
That's
Agriculture. researchers are now conducting standardized tests on hundreds of plants available at garden centers. You know about this? This is interesting. How many insects of a particular kind are drawn to and fed by a particular kind of plant?
Interesting. I know Dave Smitley, but I don't know about this grant.
Yeah, and are they looking at non-natives, natives, et cetera? Yeah. I have a question, sort of a more general question. It looks like in some ways what's happening at the municipal level is more productive than what's happening at the state or federal level. How would, and especially for those of us who want to have an influence on these policies, could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't know if that's, I would isolate each policy action by what it is and where it is, and think about it in the context of its location rather than kind of, but in general, cities have a lot of flexibility in terms of the rules that they make and establish and can test and pilot. And so it's a great source of looking for innovations that might be useful in other locations. Policies to get passed, there are an agreement that groups of people have to agree upon it. So something at the municipal level, you can have a lot more influence at the municipal level in terms of experimenting with various policy activities. Now, in terms of budgets and city budgets and availability of funding, they look differently at city levels than they do at state levels and federal levels. But I would just, instead of looking at generalizations across scale of government, I would think more in terms of the individual innovations that are occurring. And I think any type of funding that encourages homeowners to plant, I think is pretty exciting, like what's happening in the Lawns to Legumes program in Minnesota. But I think at the state level, perhaps what will be most transformative are these pollinator task forces that are being established in Connecticut, Vermont, and California. And for example, California has built-in funding mechanisms to where a portion of every registered hive, and I think it's like $1 per hive in the state of California, goes to this pollinator task force as just discretionary money to spend. And so developing, hard lining and hard wiring some sort of funding mechanism, I think is probably, those are the programs to look at first and to pay most attention to.
Okay, yeah, and those kinds of things, citizens can often comment on them and write in support of them, I believe. And there's no reason, anyone who's listening to this, I believe, municipalities, especially small ones like, Oak Park's not so big, they'll call meetings and people will not show up. So a lot of people are too disengaged. So if you show up to meetings, you will have an outsized voice. And it's worth remembering that people who live in a place really can affect what happens at that place.
Yeah, absolutely. And networking, keeping in touch, having a shared vision, but then also having fun doing so can be really powerful in terms of affecting the place where you live.
Yeah. Okay, here's a question. Has the Obama Federal Pollinator Health Task Force been of any benefit, such as promoting local protections like you just mentioned?
Yeah, I don't know. It was, disbanded under the Trump administration, so I'm not sure what has happened with it since. I think what's most important is, and it was probably most effective, was getting those 15 federal agencies together to talk about this as an issue and some level of coordination. And I don't really know, that would be a really neat area to look at in terms of what's happening procedurally, in terms of what these agencies are doing for insect pollinators, and are any of them really moving on this issue.
Mhm. Yeah, Jim says there is a congressional pollinator caucus, so that's good to know.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I thought that the Obama initiative wasn't that like kickstarting the Monarch organizations across the Midwest. I thought that like the Illinois Monarch Project and the Missouri Monarch, I don't know what you call it in Missouri, but there's all those states started putting together Monarch plans. And I thought that was as a result of that.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I do recognize that timing was about the same time those started to emerge.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay, another question. What do you think about the Xerces Bee City Bee Campus?
Yeah, I like much of what Xerces is doing. I really do. The Bee Campus, it's kind of it's a low bar to get over. Some of my grad students organized it for St. Louis University. But what's good about it is that it kind of ferrets out all of those staffers and employees within a university who are interested in insect pollinators and interested in native plants. And so they kind of come out and they have this space to meet and talk. And so that's really what you need in order to get changes. I saw changes happen in a short amount of time at my campus at St. Louis University.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so I just have one comment. Someone asked about our plant sale. I believe it's going live in March. Laura, you can correct me, and if you want to give more information about that.
The plant sale will go live around March 15th. So mid-March, and we will definitely be publicizing. So hopefully you will not be able to miss when it goes live. Pre-orders usually start in March and go through mid-May unless we sell out of plants sooner. Oh, and then pickup will be June 9th through 11th.
All right. Oh, and Stephanie just put the link to our newsletter in. So go ahead and sign up for our free, very entertaining newsletter. You'll.
Thank you, Stephanie.
All right.
Wait. Here's one. Oh, okay. Sorry, Adrian.
Oh,
do you recommend purchasing ladybugs? Is that the one you were going to?
Yeah.
I would not know on that. That maybe Adrian or Laura, you guys may know that one.
Yeah. And so I would say, no, I do not recommend purchasing ladybugs because 1, there's no way of keeping the ladybugs on your property. 2, they are not native ladybugs generally. Adrian, do you have any?
Well, I have found that the more biodiversity you have in your garden, the more species of native plants, the fewer specific pest problems you have. And I have also found that if you have at least a third of your yard in native plants, it helps provide a reservoir for beneficial insects, and your vegetables are less pest-ridden than they otherwise would be. So that's my 2 cents.
And Stephanie has added in the chat, and don't do a fall cleanup because your ladybugs will overwinter.
Along with your fireflies and your butterflies, all those other ones. And
she's had a 2-spotted ladybug in her yard.
Yeah. All right. What do you think? Lots of comments about how great, how interesting and well done this was. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Damon, for spending time on a Sunday afternoon when I'm sure you Zoom all week with your students. So.
No, it's my pleasure to be with you guys and certainly dive into more of this municipal policy stuff. I'm glad that you reached out because it just confirms that there's an interest in these municipal policies, and that's something that I've got students on. We're trying to wrangle these and at least keep the ones that we find are innovative up at the top of the list. And so anyway, this has been, you guys have helped me in keeping that moving. So thank you.
Excellent. And I put a link to Damon's lab site in the chat, and there's information on publications there if you're interested in learning more.
Yeah, if there's anything you cannot get access to, just email me and I will get you a copy of it. If you're interested in reading academic papers.
Thank you. Thank you, Damon.
All right, thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay. Whoa,
There we
people are
go.
really enthusiastic. Thank you, everybody, for all your.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's wonderful.
Candace, you're saying USA needs 7 million houses that need to be built. Well, maybe they'll be multi-family and they'll be built on already used land. That's what is how it should happen. Why wreck more prairie and forest?
Yeah, right.
All right.
Okay, thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your day. I'm
Yeah.
gonna stop recording.